Israel, you know.
Uh-huh.
And
We're going to roll it.
Okay. All right, Paula, we're going to get started now with your interview. Why don't you tell us about who you are, starting out with my name is, and then tell us about your family and where you were born and your childhood.
hello, my name is Paula Klein. I was born in Berlin, Germany. My family were immigrants to Germany themselves. My mom came from Romania, and my dad came from the Ukraine. Why they left their home countries was because they had experienced in their life about anti-Semitism and pogroms, and they were probably smart to leave, and they immigrated to Germany. Now, like every other German Jews, they cannot see single people, so a group put my dad and my mom together, and they got married, and that's how my two brothers and I were born in Germany.
What year were you born, Paula?
Pardon?
Tell us what year you were born.
I was born in December 6th, 1924. And my mom was a very ultra-religious Jewish lady, and my dad, too, was born a religious Jew. But since he, when he grew up, served in the Russian army, got away from some or most of it. But in the family, my dad was just as Jewish as my mom, because this is what she demanded. And he took my brothers when they were old enough on Friday night and Shabbat morning to synagogue, and brought home 2-3 single people to have Shabbat lunch with us. And he took the boys to Cheder to learn Hebrew, to read and to write it. And we were not a wealthy family, but a good Jewish family. And my mother tried to raise me as a good Jewish housewife, whereas my brothers could do whatever they wanted to. They had a bicycle between them and a ball, and they were able to go to the pool and swim, but a girl didn't do that because a good Jewish girl does not take their clothes off in public. In any case, we were all very happy. Since my parents spoke different languages, our only conversation at home was in Yiddish. So by the time I was 6 or 7 years old and I started school, I didn't even speak German. But kids are very versatile, and you learn it very fast. So then around...
So tell us a little about how old you were and what when you remember the Nazis taking power.
Yeah. Around 1934, we lived in Germany in a very nice apartment that had a park across the street, and we were very comfortable. And by 1934, when the Nazis were well known in Germany, we had to move out of those apartments, and we were resettled in a Jewish area. It was not as nice a place, but it did have a synagogue, and we did what we had to do. But there were Jewish butchers and grocery stores, and there was a nice synagogue. The only thing it didn't have was a Jewish school. So the synagogue converted every room that they had into schools, and we went to a Jewish school.
What do you remember about living in the middle of the 30s?
The children, before we moved into the Jewish area and we went to a non-Jewish school, we had to raise a Heil Hitler like all the non-Jewish kids. And we were very much relieved when we moved to the Jewish area and didn't have to do that. By 1934 to 36, Hitler was much more prominent, and it got very hard for for the Jews to live there, even in a Jewish area. And my parents now, since we were never involved or taught anything about politics or leaving Germany or anything, by 1936 my parents took us, we sat around the kitchen table and we talked about the Hitler situation and that they were planning and trying to plan to leave Germany. And by 1938, my parents told us that they are planning to go to Shanghai. But before we went there, we, the children, and of course all the Jews, experienced the Kristallnacht, where the uniformed Nazis, even teenage boys, were crashing all the Jewish stores and robbed them of whatever was inside, of all the merchandise, and then came over to the synagogue and took out the Torahs and the Chumash, the prayer books, all on the street, and made a tremendous bonfire. And it was just devastating, even for us children, to watch this. Now my parents told us, we have the papers, we're going to Shanghai. And they explained to us, we're taking a train from Berlin to Italy. And in Italy, there was a boat. There used to be an old Greek cargo boat that they had converted into passenger boats. And I think we were about 600 people that boarded this boat. The name of the boat, I remember, was the Conte Biancamano.
Paula, can you tell me the story of when your neighbor from upstairs, the Nazi...
While we were sitting one Saturday afternoon, this was after the Kristallnacht, I heard my parents were out with my brothers, and I heard a knock at the door. I was home, and I opened the door, and in front of it was a tall uniformed Nazi. And he looked at me and he said, "Do you remember me?" And I said, "Yes, you lived in the apartment above us, outside of this district. And my brother used to play with your son." And he smiled and he said, "Yes." He said, "And I'm here today to pick up your brothers and your dad." And he showed me the papers that he had the orders to do that. And I said, "Oh, my father and my brothers are not home." And he said, "Well, where are they?" I said, "They had some errands to do." And he says, "I need to come inside and look." I said, "No, you wait here." And I went into the house and brought the papers of the boat. That's the only one I had, and showed it to him. And I said, my brothers and my father already went to Italy, and we are leaving in a few days. And he looked at the papers and made notes in his orders and said, "Thank you very much." He was very kind, and he left. A little while later on, when my family came home, I told them the story. And they could not get over it, and they hugged me and kissed me, which was not a usually show of affection in our family. And they asked me, "Where did you learn to lie like that?" And now, of course, my brothers and father had to hide until we left for Italy, because they could not be seen. I told them that they were not in Germany anymore. A friend of my father's, on the day that we were supposed to leave, hired a car and took us to the train station where we boarded to go to Italy. And then, of course, from Italy, we went onto the boat. There were almost 600 Jews on the boat going to Shanghai. And it took this boat 4 weeks to get from Italy to Shanghai. And in Shanghai...
What was it like, Paula, leaving your life behind? What was it also like on the boat going?
Okay,
were you excited, scared?
We were kids, and it was an experience for us. And we were a very protected family. We didn't probably suffer as much under the Nazis as the adults did, because some families protect their kids more than others. We were quite protected. And on the boat itself, hundreds of people were seasick. As we kids, we had a lot of fun there. And of course, it was an experience that we never had before. Now, when we came to Shanghai, a Jewish committee met us at the boat and guided us where we were supposed to live. Now, Shanghai, if I am going to describe it, making it a square, an oblong square, 3/4 of it was the international district, which was divided by the Huangpu River, and the other 1/4 was called Hongqiu. And Hongqiu was the slum of Shanghai, where the poorest people lived, where, how do I describe this? Where when we finally got settled in a small place, there were no bathrooms. There were no water, no running water except one faucet outside of the house. In the street, there was a 2 feet wide ditch all along the road that people used as bathrooms. Everybody defected, how do you say that? Defected there and peed and put their nose snot in there. Babies and adults and men and women, all the same. In the house, we had a round wooden container with a cover on it. And that's we used in the house during the day. And in the morning, every morning around 6 o'clock, a man came with a push cart who was a farmer. And we in the meantime, put those round containers outside the door. He collected it and put it into his little push cart. And he used the defecation to fertilize his plots. Now you can imagine why all of Shanghai had tuberculosis. And after this farmer with his pushcart left, we had bamboo brushes and cleaned out this pot, so to speak, and put it back into the house for the next day. And any water we wanted, we had to get from the outside faucet. And the streets were dirty, and it was devastating.
Did many boats arrive in Shanghai after your boat?
The Contra was officially the last boat to come to China, but 2 more of them came afterwards. I don't remember the names, before the doors were closed for Shanghai immigration. Now,
can you tell us some more about what life was like in Hongqiu?
Okay, now, as people well know, the British, I have to mention this to make sense, the British people colonized for hundreds and hundreds of years all over the world. At the time when we came to Hongqiu, the British people were still colonizing there. They were tall, big, uniformed men that treated, the Chinese people at our time, not like in the United States, were small people. They were 5'2" or 4", and they were called coolies, the workers, and they did the job that usually automobiles or trucks did. They pulled loads, maybe 15, 18 people. How do you call that when they had straps on them? and those tall British people stood over them and whipped them with leather straps. It was devastating. The people that came from Germany, we all thought it was unbelievable to treat people like that. They were worse than the Nazis were. And in 1940, when the war started, the English people lost their colonization, and they left behind their buildings that they lived in. And of course, with the war, the Japanese seized all those buildings. And we were at the time 22 or 23,000 immigrants there from Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. And we were crowded into those buildings that they had. Since they were many British people, they slept in halls, not like us, because they pushed us in order to get enough space, 250 to 280 people in one hall on triple-decker beds. And in order to have a little bit of privacy, we surrounded those beds with gray blankets. And it was 100 degrees heat, so in the night we took the blankets off. We just covered them up to get a little privacy to undress and wash. There was no facilities otherwise. Each hall had about 15 showers. And if we people got a cold shower every 2 weeks, we were very lucky. Most of the times there was no soap available either. So the Japanese, since they incarcerated us, were supposed to feed us. So they made a kitchen in those camps. We called them Heim. And one of the Heims was on Ward Road. It was a street, so they called it the Wardroom Heim. That's the one we were in. And I have some pictures to show you how we lived there. And it was devastating. We lived with bed bugs, lice, fleas, roaches. The rats that ran around there were so big that the cats were afraid of them. And of course, over the years, we caught all kinds of diseases. We caught cholera and malaria and tuberculosis, and it was indescribable. And I'm going ahead of myself, but when the war was over, out of the 22 or 3,000, there were 9,000 left. We also had of course, the need was there to make a big Jewish cemetery, and since the people were all very, very poor, if they had to put a stone on the cemetery, they starved to death in order to do this. But this was the Jewish, more or less the Jewish law. After a year, you put a stone on the dead person. And I must say, I'm going ahead of myself. After the war was over, the Chinese people took all those stones and lined their streets with them. But this is in the past history. Let's say before we were incarcerated by the Japanese. Did I talk about the schools?
Yeah, just okay. It doesn't need to be in the right order, because we can edit things and we can change things and chop it up. If you're talking, feel free to keep talking. Don't stop to go back.
There's another part to this story. In the international district of Shanghai, there was a group of almost 4,000 Russian Jews that lived there. They immigrated there from the 1900s because they too in Russia had the pogroms and the anti-Semitism. And they were smart people. Some of them walked around the Manchurian border to get into Shanghai, if you know your geography. And they all became very prosperous. They usually dealt in furs and fur coats and leather, and they were all very prosperous. Among them, and even before them, there was a very rich Sassoon family, and I think they were Sephardic Jews, and Sir Victor Sassoon and Mr. Kaduri, I don't remember his first name, were two Jews that helped those Russian Jews get ahead, to get a start. And they built beautiful Jewish schools and synagogues, and they were very, very good people. They, when they heard of the immigrants coming into Hongqiu, they offered their services to the Jewish organization, because there were no schools in Hongqiu, to send their children to this Jewish school that they had in the international district. They would have the children to go to school there all week, live with them from Monday to before Shabbat Friday, and then give them a token for the bus home so they could be on the weekends to be with their parents. And which was a very generous offer, because we, the ones that went to school there, were part of their family. And another thing, most of those Russians at that time spoke Yiddish, whereas today, or as long as the communism existed in Russia, these Russian people were not allowed to learn to speak Yiddish. In any case, my two brothers and I accepted the offer, and we went to school there. My brothers kept on going, but I quit after a few weeks, because we didn't speak. All the school lessons were taught in English, and we, of course, did not speak English. And I was just bored. I couldn't do it. So I told my mom, I don't want to go to school anymore. And so she said, you have to do something. And she hired me out to a lady in the camp. Not in the camp, that was not in camp yet. To a lady that did alterations. My eyes weren't very good, and I couldn't do that. So I went out on the street, and I made some friends, girls my age, 10, 12, 14 years old. And as I got to know them better, I learned a little to speak Chinese. And I was one of the very few immigrants that were interested or did learn to speak Chinese. And they let me into their life. Now in Shanghai, and in Hongqiu, this was a very, very poor area. And people had more children than they could support. And a boy child born was always welcome. But a girl child was just one more mouth to feed. And many, many, many families, when a girl child was born, just choked them, put their hand on their neck, and they choked them, and whatever they did with it, I don't know. And some of the families did raise their girls, and afterwards or in between, they always had more children. So when those girls were 6, 8, 10 years old, they sold them, or they hired them out to places that would take them. So now, since I had those friends and they let me into their life, they showed me what they did. In Shanghai, since it was very hot, there were very few indoor restaurants. And what these girls showed me, there was a big round table on the street with benches around them. And on those benches and on that table and benches, it was kind of like an outdoor restaurant. And they served 3 meals a day. And these little girls were girls that the parents had given up, and they worked there. They helped to cook and to serve those meals, and cleaned up, and in return, they could eat all they want, and they got a little straw-filled mattress, and they could find themselves a spot in the house where they could sleep. Now, in Shanghai at the time, men and women did not eat together, so the customers were all men, coolies, low-class workers. The food was obviously good and cheap, and they were all steady customers there. Now, in Shanghai at the time, these little girls had no one to protect them or to take care of them. But the men that ate there got to know these girls and came every evening and molested them and raped them. Now, those girls were my friends. And when one of those girls got pregnant, and many of them did, not only once but many times, they were kicked out of this so-called restaurant because they didn't want pregnant girls there. And where would these girls go? They had no home. They had no place to eat. They had no place to sleep. So most of them then became prostitutes or whatever they could do to make a living. Now, is another story. On the corner street where we lived, there was a state-run clinic. And one day I saw a young lady in a white coat. She obviously was a doctor there, come out and to smoke a cigarette because she was not allowed to smoke indoors. And she waved me over and she says, "What are you talking to these girls for?" And I said, "They're my friends and they're teaching me Chinese." And she laughed and she said, "Their Chinese is very low class, you know." I said, "Well, I have nothing better to do." And she said, "Where are you from?" I said, "I was born in Germany." "Oh, you speak German?" I said, "Yes." She says, "I'll make a deal with you. You teach me German, and I will teach you a better Chinese." And from then on, every time she had a break, I went into this hospital in her room, and we exchanged languages. And then we got to talking about these girls, and I told her what was happening. I said, "Why can't you take care of these girls and and either help them have the child?" She says, "We are state-run, and we are not allowed to do that." So this doctor and I, we became, after a while, we became good friends. And I said, "Teach me how to do that, how I can help the girls." And she laughed. She says, "You're only 13 years old, you know. And I can't teach you that," she said, "but I will give you some books. They're all in Chinese, where there's some pictures in there, and you can get introduced to it." Now, I couldn't read those books at home. My mom would never have allowed anything like that. When I started opening those books and I saw those pictures, my head went around in my head. As an Orthodox Jewish girl, I never knew how babies came. I had two brothers. I never had seen them naked. And it was just beyond me. But after a while, you get used to seeing those, and she gave me more advanced books. And then one day, I was outside. She knocked at the door, and she waved me to come in. And she said, "I have a woman that's giving birth. If you watch them, you can learn better than from the books." Well, after she had let me watch this one delivery, I saw several more. And she said, "By now you should know what it is to give birth." And she showed me with her hands on my body after the baby comes out. This is something I didn't see, how to get rid of the placenta and how to cut the umbilical cord and all that. So then the time came when one of my friends was ready to give birth, and I instructed her to get a box and a few rags, because these girls had nothing, you know. She said, and they asked, what is the box for? I said, you have to, when the baby is delivered, you have to wrap the baby in a little blanket or whatever you have, put it in a box, and put the baby in front of a church or a business, and maybe somebody will raise the child. I wanted nothing to do with what happened after the baby was born. Okay, and I said, and get a blanket for yourself to lay on. And I went into my mom's sewing box that she had, and got a scissor and a little string, and also found some rags in my house that we needed, and I filled a jar with water, and we all went to a deserted place, and the girl laid down on her blanket, and we were waiting for the baby to come. It was the first one. It wasn't all that good for the girl, but this little, she was a doll, a 13-year-old girl. There wasn't a peep out of her. And the baby came, and I took, yes, before we went out there, we took 2 more girls. I wanted them to see how this was done. And I needed the help to carry all the stuff that we needed to do it. So the baby was born, and I let her rest for a little while, and then like this doctor showed me, I pushed her placenta out, and the girls, while I cleaned up the little girl, the girls put the baby, and then we cut the umbilical cord and all the things that this doctor friend taught me, and we put the baby in a box, and we went home. And the next day, this little mother went back to work like yesterday, as if nothing had happened. And during the time, from the time I was 13 until I was 15, and we got incarcerated by the Japanese, those Chinese friends that watched me, and I delivered 18 babies. And of course, afterwards, I never saw these girls anymore, because we were incarcerated by the Japanese and we couldn't get out of the camps. Okay? This was one experience that people don't know or don't want to know, you know.
Would you like a glass of water or anything? Take a little break?
No, thank you.
Okay. Maybe you can tell us about your father.
About what?
About your father.
Not yet. Okay, just a minute. Yes, during the time we were incarcerated by the Japanese, as I said before, you know, we caught all kinds of diseases. Many people died. And some people that came to Shanghai with money had opened in the camp little bakeries, little shoe repairs, a barber shop, and we all tried to make a living to subsidize the food that the Japanese gave us. Toward the end of the war, which the Japanese lost, they had very little food for us, much less, because they could not even feed their own 16, 18-year-old soldiers. So we, of course, suffered much more than we should have. At the end, close to the end of the war, my father, close to the end of the war, I was an apprentice in a beauty shop. And there was an unpaid job. I learned how to do the job. It was an unpaid job. And they made me wash the towels on the washboard and clean up the hair that they cut and all those things that an apprentice does. And every once in a while, these customers gave me tips. And whatever work my brothers found and got a little pay, we all gave to Mom to help put a little more food on the table. One day my dad went to the doctor. He had an infection on his leg, which by the end of the year, by the end of the time of the war, our doctors had very little or no medication or anything to help sick people. Anyway, my dad had this infection on his leg, which started pussing and got gangrened. And the doctor said he had to get his leg amputated, or else he would die. So my father agreed to have it done, but there was no sedatives, not even ether, which they used at the time. But the leg had to come off. So they gave my dad half a cup of vodka and put a wooden spoon in his teeth, between his teeth, and they took the leg off. And he survived it. It grew closed. And while he was in the hospital, he used to be a heavy smoker. The only sedative, so to speak, that he got was from the tips that I got from my customers. I always brought him 2 cigarettes a day, which he cut into half, so he had 4 times the smoke. And that was the time when I came to visit him. That was the way he kept alive, more or less. Anyway, he made it. He got out of the hospital. He walked on crutches. And we, the 3 kids, tried to pacify him and said, Papa, after the war's over, we'll get you the best prosthesis available, and blah, blah, blah. And the sad thing is, we didn't have enough food for him to really get better. The doctor said he needs to have garlic and onions that have a lot of vitamins, which we didn't know at the time. So my brothers went to the nearby farms and stole those at night. But whatever, it didn't help. He just died before the war was over. And his stone, what do you call those? Stone on the grave is now also in Shanghai on some street that they paved with the stones. I did tell you the story about the stones, didn't I? Okay, what else?
You don't only need to, you can tell stories that we didn't put here.
What about
just about living in Shanghai.
what about
more about
the leprosy? Shall I tell you about?
Sure, and just about the conditions of where you lived and how crowded it was.
Okay, during the end of the war, in Shanghai there were several leprosy, not institutes. What do you call that? Colonies, leprosy colonies. And toward the end of the war, Shanghai could not sustain them anymore. While the leprosy colonies were going, there were Greek priests that gave up their life to help them in as long as the leprosy colonies were intact. And of course, you could not touch the people that had leprosy, because just one touch, and those priests knew that after a while they will catch the disease too. But anyway, the Shanghai could not sustain those colonies any longer, so they opened them up, and you saw on the street corners all these people, children, men and women, with half noses and half ears, and the arms and the toes falling off, and it was unbelievable to look at them. Yet you could not help them. You could not give them any money, because nobody would, if they wanted to buy something with the money from them that they had touched. You understand? So my brothers and I, you have to cut this out anyway. Okay. Shanghai was a tropical climate, and for instance, watermelons grew wild like a weed. So some industrious Chinese people gathered the watermelons and cut them up, and you could eat all the watermelons that you wanted. And they gave us a newspaper cone. As long as the watermelons that you ate, you spat the seeds in there. The business for these people were not the watermelons, but the seeds. They roasted them and they sold them. So we gathered a few pieces of watermelon and the little food or fruit that we stole or whatever, and went out in the afternoon and put them in front of those leper people, so they had something to eat. Most of them died anyway from starvation or anything. And those priests, this is another story, but I need to mention it. Those priests, they're called Leprosy. There was a time you have to alter it the way you want to. There was a time when my son went to school in Israel, and during the summer vacation, I went there, and the school took trips to the Sinai before the Sinai was given over to the Arabs. And right within walking distance of the Mount Sinai, there were two Greek churches, Roman Greek churches. And in the basement, which was not closed up by rocks, it was all glassed in, and all the bones of the priests that helped the leper people all over the world were in there to see. I think this is really worth to mention when you get it in, okay? What else am I going to say?
Well, can you tell us the story of Infected?
Okay, this was earlier when we were incarcerated by the Japanese. I was just 15 then. As I mentioned before, we had all kinds of lice and fleas and everything. I had a bite either by a spider or by a mosquito, they never knew, on my lower leg. And kids scratched. I scratched it, it got infected, and it turned gangrene. And I remember my mom brought some medication from Germany, and including that, she had a small vial of little crystals. They were blue little crystals. And when you put them into water, they turned purple. And that was an infectious, not an sanitary, or what do you call that, solution. And the doctor, since they had nothing else, the doctor told my mom to wash this wound several times during the day to keep it clean. Well, it grew more deeper and more pussy, and after a while, my mom ran out of the disinfectant, which was called Übermangansaurus Kali. I don't know how I remember that name, but it stuck with me. And the doctor told us, we have no disinfection. Make your daughter pee into a container every morning. The first P has some disinfection in it, and use that instead of what you used before. In any case, after I was sitting in a chair with my leg up for 9 months. After several months, it stopped pussing and reversed the course. And this hole was so deep that you could see the bone, the shin bone in it. But after it reversed, it took a few months and it healed up, and I didn't have my leg amputated too. What else?
Well, tell us about war and what happened with your family, how long you stayed in Shanghai, and what
And
your
after
life
the
was
war?
like after the war, and then what happened to your family after the war.
Well, after the war, the first 2 years before we were incarcerated by the Japanese, my parents knew that sooner or later we would go out. And my mom had a cousin in New York, and we applied for entry visas to go to New York after the incarceration. And after the war, during the war, most of the consulates in Shanghai closed, including the American one. After 1945, when the war was over, it took the American consulate 3 years to open again. And by 1948, we came to the United States. When we came to the United States, during the time after the war was over, in 1948, I got married and I had a child in Shanghai. And when we finally came to the United States, the Jewish agencies here helped us some. We came with a 1.5-year-old child and a $20 bill and one suitcase between the three of us. And we all came via San Francisco, but we were only allowed to remain in San Francisco for 2 weeks because there were hundreds and hundreds of people coming from Shanghai this way. My brother, who went 6 months earlier to the United States, who was single then, went to New York to the people that gave my mom the affidavits. And this cousin we had never met before had a fur business, and my brother learned how to do those things, you know, and he didn't like it. So anyway, you must understand, when we came in 1948, today's immigrants, no matter where from the world they come today. They get housing, they get food stamps, they get medical help, you know. When we came, there was no such a thing. We had one suitcase and a $20 bill and a baby, and no financial help from anybody. And we didn't speak English. This, of course, was the worst. And the first, we had to live someplace. So the 2 weeks that we were in San Francisco and we had to leave, we decided we do not want to go to New York in the climate that New York had. And it was a big, we bought a little booklet of the United States, and there was too many people there for people that spoke no English and had no money. So we picked out of this book, we picked Seattle, because it said in Seattle, it was little industry, mostly farmland. Okay, this was 68 years ago. And so we picked Seattle. We came to Seattle and we looked for a place to live. So since we're living in this area now, you know Broadway. Here on Broadway and Pine Street, there's the community college there now. Well, at that time, there were only 2 buildings on the corner, of which they tore one down, and the one building was called the Edison School. Okay, one of the buildings is still there. And across the street from the building, there was a sign in the window, room for rent. So I looked at my husband and he looked at me, and we nodded at each other. We went to look at that. There was a front window, a front room that faced the street, and there were 3 bedrooms in there. And a woman with 3 daughters lived there. You don't have to put that into... The woman with 3 daughters lived there, and they could not manage the rent, so they wanted to rent the front room. Now, us coming from where we lived was 280 people. It was heaven on earth. But the reason why we rented this room was because it was right across the street of the Edison School. So one day, my husband had 8 hours to learn English, just walked across the street, and I stayed home with the baby, and the next day we exchanged it. And in 4 or 6 weeks, we learned how to speak English. 8 hours a day, every day. We learned how to not speak English, but communicate a little bit. So I started to clean houses and put the baby, and that time there was $1 an hour, and I put the baby into a daycare center where I paid 50 cents. So for 8 hours work, I brought home $4, you know. And whatever we worked, we learned how to speak English real quick. And after we learned how to speak, we never worked for anybody anymore. We always had our own businesses, which is none of this business. What else do you want to know?
Did you visit Israel, or did you have family that went there?
When we came to the United States, we came on a quota system, okay? Germans, Austrian quotas, they were all open. My mother was born in Romania, and she could not come in. The Romanian quota was closed. So my youngest brother, who was 20 at the time, told us, because we had a kid, and my oldest brother was already here, he says, you go to the States, I'll take Mom to Israel, and I'll find her a family to live with, or a room or something. There was no money, do you understand? We had to depend on others. And I, having the German quota, I can come to the States anytime, okay? So instead of him leaving from Shanghai to the States, he took my mom to Israel. He was a 20-year-old, tall, handsome guy. I'll show you the picture later. And as soon as he put his big feet on Israeli ground, they drafted him. And he became a pilot, a fighter pilot, okay, in the army. And of course, he met his wife there, and he remained in Israel. And he raised his family there, and blah, blah, blah. I invited them here. They were here 2 or 3 times while they were alive. Both of my brothers are gone. And my mother had to wait 11 years before her quota came through to come here. And when she was here, I had children then I had 3 children then in the meantime. When she was over there, she wanted to come here to see the kids. And when she was here, she wanted the kids over there. So as long as she lived 10 more years, she went back and forth and back and forth. And when she turned 75, she says, I want to be buried in Israel, you know, because my father was in Shanghai. She didn't want to be by him. So we by then were well off already. So we bought her clothes and shoes and medication and whatever she needed, and we sent her to Israel. 6 months later, she was back and she was buried here. Anyway, every family has a story to tell. So can you make sense out of this?
Oh, this is great.
And you will cut.
Around and take the good parts out.
How-
Have you ever been back to Shanghai?
Yes, 9 years ago, when, you know, we had during all these years, we had Shanghai reunions in San Francisco and New York and all over the place. And people came from Australia and South America to those meetings, okay? And as a matter of fact, I have a picture of one, I sometimes will show you. And 9 years ago, we heard that the Chinese government, the Shanghai government, was going to destroy Hongqiu, the really, really bad part, and build high rises because they have to, they have to house their people. They were always overpopulated, as you know, even though they were only allowed to have one child. Did you know that? There was a law that the Chinese people could not have more than one child. Anyway, so we were pretty well off at the time, and I had the money. I was divorced then, and I had the money. So my two older children, the one that was in Shanghai, and one was born here, my two oldest grandchildren and I, we went to Shanghai. And over there we met an Israeli guide, and he took us to all the places that we wanted to go. And my daughter, the oldest one, and all the others saw the camps. I have to tell you one more story, the jail. The only thing that was different in Hongqiu, they were still as poor as ever. The only thing they did, they covered up the trenches where people defecated. That was the only improvement. And what was I telling you? I was going to tell you later.
Jails?
Yeah. When we were in camp, you don't have to put that in there. He can turn this off if he wants to.
It's okay.
My brother, my youngest brother, when we were incarcerated by the Japanese, of course they were bayoneted Japanese soldiers all over. And one of them pushed my brother. I was 15, he was 14, not quite 14 yet. He pushed my brother, and my brother pushed him back. And across from the Wardwood camp was the biggest Chinese jail of all Shanghai. And it was 2 blocks long, Anyway, this Japanese manacled him, and my brother, who was not quite 14 then, was sent to jail. It was just across the street from the camp, just across the street. They kept him there for 8 weeks, and they only fed him rice and water. And you may have never heard of this. There's a disease, if you don't get any vitamins, you get beriberi. Have you ever heard of beriberi? And my brother, who was a skinny, tall guy, came out. He was 300 pounds. And beriberi is the body accumulates water. And after a while, if you stay with the beriberi long enough, the pores open and the water starts creeping out and you die. Well, this jail, of course, also suffered financial problems. And they didn't want to keep him any longer because they would have to take care of the burial, So they opened the doors for him. And my brother walked across the street to the camp. And we had sentries, our own people at the camp, and one of the men from the camp saw him walking, so he walked across the street and helped my brother back into the camp. He got 6-inch needles pushed into his back for 6 months to get the water out, and he survived that too. See, this was the treatments we got.
So in the camp there was a Jewish.
You know what a Quonset hut is? We had 2 Quonset huts that the English people had left because this was their place where they lived. One of them they converted into a hospital, long rows, bed, and at the end was a nurse. And the other one was more or less like a clinic, when people were sick and blah, blah, blah. And in the beginning, the Jewish agencies sent in some medication and bandages and blah, 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 until during the war, all this help was discontinued because they couldn't come in and out,
How big was the camp?
You will see on the pictures how big it was, Here's another thing that you will...
Describe it?
Pardon?
Can you describe it?
I'll show it to you. Better than describing it. have to tell you one more thing. The man that ran, there were many camps. I'm only talking about the Wardrobe camp, okay, the one that we lived in. There were many such camps because we were 22,000 people. The Wardrobe camp was run by a Japanese. His name was Goya, okay? This Goya was a mean bastard, okay? For instance, this should be in there, but I can't do much more. This Goya, when they could not feed us any longer, or very little, they gave people passports to leave the camp for a day or two, whatever mood he was in, you know. So they could go out and maybe gather such a bag or whatever, get food or whatever, make a little money to give us a little better sustenance. Well, now, my husband was a short guy. He was only 5'5", and broad shoulders. And this was the way the Japanese, and he wore glasses. This was the way Japanese people looked. And if you meet some today, they still look the same. And those people always got a passport to go out 3-4 days. My husband always got a passport. If somebody like him or you came and he had to look up on you, you could starve to death. Never did you get a passport. And he said, you go into this corner and face the wall, and he let you stand there 3-4 hours. And if he was in a bad mood, some corners had little pebbles that he prepared on the ground, and they made you kneel on them for hours. This is the power he had over the immigrants in the home. In this book, if you read it carefully, in this book, after the war, some of the immigrants beat this Goya up and almost made a pulp out of him. But you have to I'll show you one picture of the camp, just one, okay?
Should you like this picture usable? Video, or something you will scan later, or what?
We can always scan it later.
Okay.
In this book, did I tell you my brother's in this book?
Yeah.
Here's the camp. Come over here. Oh, come here. This is the Wardrobe
I'm not
camp.
sure if it's down there.
Okay, we might tape a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, for this.
Yeah.
There's a
It's okay
picture
for
here.
you to point at it, and then after you're done,
This is not the Wardrobe home. This
all
is
right,
the
so we'll
Chauffeur.
start this again. Here's what we'll do, Paula. You do exactly what you just did and tell the story of who lived where, and then after you're done, we'll take a picture of.
I want to show
we'll
you
look at the picture.
I show you my camp first. Okay, just have you got time?
Can you tell us this picture again? What you just told me about who?
This camp was on Chauffeur Road. Was a different camp, and I was not that familiar with it because I lived in my camp and we couldn't go out and examine the others. But this camp was one of the buildings that the British left behind after they lost their colonization there. Okay, and most of them looked somewhat like that. And in the bottom row, there were no kitchens or any facilities like this in the camps. In the bottom row, there were halls where single men lived, many of them, and on the other side where the single women lived. And upstairs, this is the way it was set up in my camp. I don't know how it was set up in there. It must have been similar. And upstairs in the halls lived couples on 3-decker beds, because if they had children under 13, they lived on the third tier of the bed. Okay?
How many people lived in each one of these halls?
In this hall, 250, 280 people.
So say it in a full sentence.
Huh?
Remember, answer me in a complete sentence.
They were not stalls, and the showers were not stalls or anything. They were just long rooms with shower heads on the top. And if we were lucky, I'm talking from my experience, we got a cold shower maybe every 2 weeks. And if we were lucky and careful with the distribution of soap. We had soap. Most of the time we did not to take a shower. And it was hot there and sweaty. And there was a shower every 2 weeks certainly was not enough, you know. But I want you to see the camp that I lived in. Here you can see the Canto Bianco Mountain. And in 1937, before, you know, the Japanese were at war with the Chinese, the English people, or some people, let's see who most of it, and this was very close to where our camp for, this was bombarded by, you will read by whom, I can't remember. Here, this is our camp, you will see this. This is the camp we lived in. And if you would, I want you to take this home and look at this. And this is the way we lived. This is the way we hung our little laundry, you know. And this is the way, there's many more pictures in there. Let me see. You want to write down the page number? There isn't even a number.
Can we take a shot of those pictures now? Or what's the best way to do it, do you think, Don?
Well, as
Back to the beginning.
Yeah,
Can
this
maybe-
this is where the camp is here.
If you have any more memories, because you lived for almost 6 years as a child in Berlin
Yeah.
under the Nazis.
But you see, I told you in here, my parents were very protective. We were never told about Nazis or wars or Jews were Jews, you know, and we lived in a very, all of our friends and relatives were all Jewish. We lived very protected. We didn't know that
didn't
much.
experience any
Until-
things on
until-
the street before Kristallnacht, or did you maybe
I
hear
told
things
you
on the radio or the newspapers?
when we went to the Christian school, we, like the others, said Heil Hitler. You know, because we didn't know anything about it. What do 6, 7-year-old kids know about war or politics or anything? We only started learning when they kicked us out from our apartment and moved us into the Jewish what do you call that, part of the city. And even then, my parents didn't tell us until they knew they had to leave, and then they explained to us about Hitler and that we have to work together because Mom had to go to work to make money to go get out of Germany and stuff like that. Now, upstairs here, there's a woman whose name is Ruth Sumter. She was, besides, I want to tell you something. She also came to Shanghai with her family, but she's 7 years younger than I. So I was 13, almost 13 when I got to Shanghai, and she was 6. Now, when you have a child, a 6-year-old knew nothing. She knows nothing about the history or anything because she was that much younger. But when I was an apprentice in the beauty shop, she was my apprentice, you know. And she has a sister that's even younger. She just came yesterday because Ruth had a birthday from Los Angeles or someplace. These people don't know. It depends on what age you were. Yeah. You understand? And also, we've been here now 68 years. And that was 10 years back, so that's 70 or 80 years. Most people were grown-ups, and all these are dead. I have heard from the agency that still talk about this. There are about 100 people of the Shanghai left, and she and I are one of them, or 2 of them.
So I think we're almost done. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Any other stories? Any other memories that you have?
I tell you, my memory isn't what it used to be. I think I've talked enough.
I think you've done a really nice job, and
I appreciate
thank you for doing
but
this.
I couldn't have done it without your help. This was really very important.
Thank you, Paul.
Can you think of anything any stories you heard that you'd like to follow up on?
No, I thought you did a good job too.
Yeah.
I don't know whether I've looked into